The rise of a wicked ruler pulling the strings from the shadows, a great migration of the sky, and the rise of artificial life. These are more Dark Nostradamus predictions for 2025. Nostradamus predicted the rise of a ruler who would be cloaked in darkness and would rise from the east to gain power, but not in the way you might think. We're not talking about some traditional monarch, the kind that steps out in robes and gives big speeches. Instead, this quote-unquote shadow monarch would operate behind the scenes, a person who doesn't need a spotlight to wield power, someone who stays in the background, pulling strings in boardrooms, through political maneuvering and controlling the flow of information. And if you think about it, this idea feels pretty relevant in 2025. Think about how big tech companies and media moguls already have more influence over our daily lives than we realize. In a way, they control what we see, hear, and think. What if someone took that to a whole new level, influencing entire elections, shaping public opinion, impacting economies without ever being seen on the front page of a newspaper? Maybe this shadow monarch doesn't need to be a single person. Maybe it could represent a whole network of power controlled by big corporations and tech giants. Now, Nostradamus also talked about winged beings fleeing the fires of the earth, which sounds pretty dramatic, but most of his work does, to be fair. But what could this really mean? Well, on the surface, it sounds like some sort of mass migration, and honestly, makes sense. With climate change pushing temperatures higher, wildfires, floods, rising sea levels, we could see huge movements of people in 2025. But what about the sky part? Are we talking about birds? Or is Nostradamus hinting at a future where people are forced to flee disaster zones by air? Coastal cities around the world are already facing the possibility of sinking because of rising sea levels, so maybe whole populations will be airlifted to safety. And let's not forget about wildlife too. Species already struggling to survive might have to migrate in ways that we haven't seen them migrate before. It's entirely possible that animal migration patterns could change dramatically thanks to all the chaos. In short, this may not just be referring to human migration, it could be this global shift with people and animals fleeing to find safety on a planet that's getting harder and harder to live on. Now this one's super interesting. Nostradamus mentioned a new race emerging from unseen hands. Now, some might view this as extraterrestrials from some unknown planet, but to me, this sounds a lot more like artificial life. In 2025, AI, or even the idea of genetically engineered beings taking on more of a role in our society, could be a reality. We've already got AI running in the background of most tech we use, and biotech is making huge strides as well. So why not take this a step further? So imagine a future where we're not just building robots or software to help with menial tasks, but actually creating entirely new beings, sentient robots, the type that pretty much every dystopian sci-fi movie warns us against. But this could also mean lab-grown organisms, either good or bad. Maybe we'd create something that could clean up pollution or help with farming in inhospitable places. As we get better at creating these beings though, what happens when they surpass us? In the case of robots, they get smarter than us, not hard. And in the case of the lab organisms, they could just get out of control. We're already seeing AI that can do tasks better than humans, so what's next? If our AI becomes too advanced, could we end up with something we can't control? Nostradamus might have been talking about the risks of what happens when humans try to play God, creating life without fully understanding the consequences. Nostradamus said that the brightest orb would crack. The brightest orb? Well, it seems to me that's either the sun or the moon. Hopefully neither will end up splitting in half. Thankfully, I haven't heard any scientists worrying about that happening anytime soon, but this could be a metaphor for some kind of accident in space exploration, maybe. We're already planning lunar missions through NASA's Artemis program, and the idea of creating a permanent base on the moon is being talked about more and more. But what if something goes horribly wrong? Maybe during one of these missions, there's a huge failure or some kind of space-related disaster. Imagine the ripple effects something like that could have. For starters, it would cause a loss of trust in that technology, and we could have a major issue related to space where we take a step back as a species and hold off on further missions. That would just be sad. Nostradamus talked about a ruler from the land of fire. What could he mean by a land of fire? A hot part of the world, somewhere with a lot of volcanoes, a place with a lot of conflict? Well, that would make sense because supposedly this ruler is betrayed, possibly taken down by someone or a bunch of people close to them. Imagine you have a ruler in, say, an oil-rich country who's been in charge for ages, but then, out of nowhere, the people closest to them, maybe even their own family, turn on them. It's not out of the question, it's happened before. Nostradamus may have been warning us that power doesn't last forever. If someone gets too comfortable with total control, it might be the very people they trust who bring them down. This could also apply to big, powerful corporations that fall apart, either from consumers like us turning on them, or some whistleblower coming forward and blowing the lid off all the messed up stuff they do behind the scenes. Oh, how I'd love to see something like that happen this year. Seas will cry out. Well, that doesn't sound very good. And it's hard to ignore how relevant that sounds in today's world with rising sea levels and the ever-growing threat of climate change. The seas could quite literally start to weep in the form of flooding. Coastal cities like Miami, New York, places in Southeast Asia could be underwater in decades, but maybe Nostradamus was actually writing about something even bigger than that, something more literal to the weeping part. That the seas are crying out for attention because of an environmental crisis. Nostradamus could have been talking about the tipping point, the moment when humanity is forced to confront the fact that we've been harming the environment for too long. If the oceans rise faster than we can prepare for, could trigger mass migrations, wars over resources, and a complete rethinking of how we are going to live on this planet. Maybe he was saying the seas aren't just rising, they're sending us loud and clear messages that we need to change our ways or we'll face the consequences. Or maybe a whole bunch of mermaids will just get sad and start crying or something. I don't know, don't ask me to save the ocean. What am I supposed to do? This one's pretty chilling. Nostradamus warned about a plague of the mind, and it's not hard to imagine that he was talking about mental health. The mental health crisis we're seeing today, with so many people struggling with anxiety, depression, burnout, a mental plague could be on the table in 2025. Think about it. We're living in an age where social media is this constant presence. Bad news is everywhere, and yes, I'm aware I'm not really helping with a video like this, so it's no surprise that more and more people are feeling disconnected, overwhelmed, and isolated. What if this mental strain becomes so widespread that it starts to affect entire societies? What if entire populations start struggling with mental health on this massive scale, so much so that it becomes a major global issue? It's hard to say that that's not already happening. In 2025, this silent plague of the mind could take a heavy toll on the world, leading to breakdowns in trust and an increase in social unrest. Nostradamus wrote about sands rising and flowers blooming. Well, that actually sounds like a pretty hopeful prediction, but what exactly could it mean? Maybe this is about efforts to turn deserts into livable, productive land, like those projects trying to green deserts in places like the Sahara or Australia. In 2025, we could see more of these kinds of projects. That could be great, but just for the sake of it, let's look at the worst case scenario, because that's kind of the whole point of this video. What if in trying to make deserts more habitable, we end up messing with the ecosystems? Say you had a desert being transformed into farmland, but at the cost of wildlife and biodiversity. Not that there's a whole lot of that in the desert, but look, my job here is to make things sound as foreboding as possible. This next one's all about wildfires. Nostradamus talked about fiery birds descending from the sky, and while it could be a metaphor for anything, it sounds an awful lot like wildfires. In 2025, we could be looking at more severe and frequent ones caused by rising temperatures and dry conditions. California, Australia, parts of South America, they've been dealing with more massive fires that are only getting worse. But what about the birds part? Could this be referring to the planes and helicopters used to fight the fires? Or could it maybe be referring to something from the sky, like a weapon causing them? So yeah, maybe this isn't about natural disasters at all, but something more intentional and sinister. Either way, it's looking like wildfires are going to continue being a major problem in the coming years. Finally, we have sleeping giants. Nostradamus talked about ancient giants who've slept for eons but will rise again. He may have been talking about something more metaphorical, but let's just take this in the most literal sense for fun. What if he was writing about something seismic? In 2025, we could see major natural disasters. In this case, volcanic eruptions or earthquakes. earthquakes, places that have been quiet for centuries. Imagine dormant volcanoes or fault lines that haven't really stirred in a long time suddenly becoming active again. This would send shockwaves through the world, so maybe Nostradamus was warning us that something big, something we've also forgotten about, could suddenly wake up and throw everything off balance. Well, with all that said, I've been your host, James. I'll catch you, yes, you specifically, in the next video.